What more do we know about these U.S. tariffs?
Well, the big thing, as you said there, Renee, is certainly around the timeline. I think this is exactly what U.S. President Donald Trump had indicated yesterday, that the tariffs were for sure going to be announced. My understanding is that the federal government was officially informed, for the first time, I should say, in this entire process, that this was going to happen this morning. Cabinet is set to meet at 3 o'clock Eastern, so exactly an hour from now, where, of course, this will be the subject of conversation. And then we do anticipate that we will hear from the Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, at 6 o'clock Eastern this evening. They're going to announce Canada's response. We know from our previous reporting as well that response is already formulated to a certain degree, that they will announce immediate tariffs, counter tariffs on something like 10 consumer things like orange juice from Florida, Kentucky bourbon, but that there are two other tranches of more substantial counter tariffs that they will do a short, quick, kind of 2-week consultation on, one worth $37 billion, another worth $110 million. And then those counter tariffs would be ready to launch after that consultation period. So that part is already in play. How much further the government is prepared to go beyond that, because this is nearly worst case scenario, will be the subject of a number of questions, I imagine, directed to the Prime Minister and his Finance Minister this evening.
So this has been the source of a lot of anxiety here in Canada. When can we expect to know more?
Well, I think certainly when we hear from the Prime Minister tonight, but this is pretty explicit, right? We know when now and we know what. So the threat had been 25% across the board. It looks like energy is getting somewhat of an exemption from that, at least the full breadth of it at 10%. But even a 10% on tax, which is what these are, right? This is just taxes that the president is applying to Canadian goods coming into the United States. Even a 10% increase will have a turnaround impact or a knock-on impact on the prices that Americans pay, for example, at the pumps. I think the other interesting thing that I take from this is that it is so centered on fentanyl, A, but B, the border. I mean, in one world, that's sort of reason for a bit of a silver lining, because we are doing stuff to address the issue at the border, both at the federal level and a number of provinces with their own resources as well. The downside is, I mean, it's kind of wild to think about how we're getting a 25% tariff, and so is Mexico. The amount of fentanyl that the U.S. is catching, according to their own numbers, coming into their country from our border is about 0.2% of what they're catching from at the southern border. And yet the sort of tariff, in a punitive way as it's being applied, is being applied in an equal fashion to both our countries. So that's sort of another sort of confounding part of all of this, but it is what it is. It's certainly what he threatened. And again, that timeline, according to I've now spoken to two sources, is headed for Tuesday for implementation.
And Vassy, how could Canada be affected by not only the tariffs, but also potential counter tariffs that we might be hearing about tonight?
Well, in a number of different ways. First, I should say it depends on how long those tariffs are in place and the substance of what the counter tariffs are, right? That will all inform the overall economic impact, but there's no getting away from it. I mean, even in the worst case scenario modeled out a few days ago by the Bank of Canada Governor, Tiff Macklem, there was an economic contraction of about 3%. 3%. That's a massive amount in just the first year. Private sector economists have talked about millions of Canadian jobs being at stake, again, depending on how long these tariffs actually do stick around. But the fact that they will apply across the board is certainly, like I said, a worst case scenario that economists and people in the federal government were working with. Perhaps, if it had been applied only to one sector, there are certainly ways to attempt to mitigate that damage. But as Tiff Macklem said, even monetary policy can only do so much if the entire economy is slapped with this level of tariff. And then when it comes to counter tariffs, that will also be tough, not just on the economy kind of in the aggregate, but particularly on consumers, right? We've finally seen the rate of inflation slow. It's increasing a fraction of what it was a year ago or 2 years ago. And this will undoubtedly, if those counter tariffs are in place for a while, again, it's a tax that we have to add to stuff coming in here, which makes the stuff we buy even more expensive. So there's not just an impact on the size of the economy, the rate at which it grows or contracts, and the level of employment, but also on the prices that you and I and everyday Canadian consumers pay at the cash register, which means that it's almost impossible to overstate the economic impact of something like this, particularly if it's around for a while.
And Vassy, last I saw, Donald Trump doesn't have any public events scheduled for today. Apparently, he's off playing golf somewhere. Is that a surprise to you? Do you think that we can expect to hear anything from him anytime soon?
Your guess is as good as mine. Certainly, I have been watching the same thing. I mean, a Saturday Mar-a-Lago golf round is not out of the norm for the president, but I have yet to see anything on the public schedule. Certainly, we're all waiting. I think it's interesting to note the degree to which this is not the #1 story in the United States right now. It might become now that it will be official, but I think it shows you sort of how much stuff Donald Trump is doing that is controversial, that is drawing a reaction. And much of it in the United States domestically is garnering a bigger reaction than what's happening right now. And I think that's something I'll really be watching for over the coming days. A, what is the public reaction in the United States like? But B, where are our allies in Congress, in the Senate, at the state level? Who ends up speaking up for us and speaking out against the imposition of these tariffs, if anybody, because so far they've by and large been pretty silent, which is very different than that initial round of NAFTA negotiations with Trump a number of years ago, where we had a lot of allies, particularly at the state level, who came to bat for us. So very curious to see if they remain silent or if they get the guts to speak out.
And of course, I know you'll be watching very closely for anything coming down the pipe today, as will we. Vassy Kapelos, senior CTV political correspondent, thank you very much for this today. Appreciate it.
Anytime.